The sound of metal striking metal was not just the rhythm of labor, it was the drumbeat of liberation being hammered into existence, one secret strike at a time. If you want to hear more stories of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful journey through history like this one. The forge burned hotter than the Mississippi sun, and in its orange glow stood a man whose hands held both the chains of his bondage and the keys to his freedom. His name was Isaac, and though the world tried to reduce him to property, his mind remained a fortress no master could ever breach. This is not a story of victimhood, but of genius concealed in calloused palms, of hope hammered into iron, of a man who understood that the same hands that built cages could also craft the tools to dismantle them. Every ring of his hammer was a prayer, every spark that flew from the anvil, a tiny star of possibility in the darkness of captivity. Isaac had been born into slavery on the Thornhill Plantation in northern Mississippi in 1831, when the institution of human bondage was woven so deeply into the fabric of America that many could not imagine a world without it. His mother, Ruth, had been a house servant who whispered stories of freedom into his infant ears, tales of ancestors who had walked as kings and queens in lands across the ocean, before ships and chains had stolen their destinies. His father, whose name he never knew, had been sold away before Isaac could walk, a ghost that haunted the edges of his mother's eyes whenever she grew quiet. Planiju estructura narrativa cum cliffhangers estratégicos. I'm at about 280 words, need to add a cliffhanger around 250 words mark. Let me continue and add one soon. But Ruth taught Isaac something more valuable than bitterness. She taught him to observe, to learn, to see opportunity where others saw only oppression. "They can chain your body, child," she would whisper as she rocked him, "but your mind is yours alone. Fill it with knowledge, with wisdom, with dreams they cannot shackle." Those words became the foundation upon which Isaac would build his entire existence. When Isaac was 7 years old enough to be considered useful, the plantation's blacksmith, a grizzled enslaved man named Jeremiah, who had lost 3 fingers in the forge, took notice of the boy's quick mind and steady hands. Jeremiah had been working metal for 40 years, his body bent by labor but his spirit somehow unbroken. He saw something in young Isaac that reminded him of himself, before the weight of decades had pressed down upon his shoulders. Without being asked, Jeremiah began teaching the boy the ancient art of metalworking, the secrets of fire and iron that had been passed down through generations of smiths, both free and enslaved. The forge became Isaac's university. While other children his age were sent to the cotton fields to work from dawn until dusk, Isaac learned to read metal the way scholars read books. He learned which temperature turned iron malleable, how carbon content affected strength, the precise angle at which to strike to bend rather than break. But Jeremiah taught him more than technique. He taught him patience, observation, and the critical art of appearing simple while being anything but. "White folks think we're nothing but muscle and sweat," Jeremiah would say in a low voice when they were alone, the clang of the hammer masking his words. "Let them think it. A man who is underestimated holds a weapon they can't even see." But what Jeremiah didn't know was that Isaac was already planning something that would risk both their lives. Years passed, and Isaac grew from a quick-minded boy into a powerful young man whose skill at the forge began to surpass even Jeremiah's. By the time Isaac reached his 20th year, he could craft anything from delicate hinges to massive plowshares, from intricate decorative ironwork for the master's house to the brutal instruments of bondage, shackles, chains, and locks that kept his people imprisoned. Every time Isaac forged a chain, something twisted in his stomach. Every lock he crafted felt like a betrayal of his own humanity. But he forced himself to do the work with excellence because he understood that mastery of his craft was the only power available to him. The master of Thornhill Plantation, a man named Silas Thornhill, prided himself on owning one of the finest blacksmiths in 3 counties. He would bring visitors to the forge to show off Isaac's work, speaking about him as if he were a prized horse or a well-trained dog. "This boy can make anything," Thornhill would boast, his hand proprietarily gripping Isaac's shoulder. "Pure, natural talent. No teaching required, just God-given ability." The irony of denying Jeremiah's years of patient instruction, the erasure of Isaac's intelligence and dedication, would have been laughable if it hadn't been so dehumanizing. But Isaac had learned Jeremiah's lesson well. He kept his eyes down, his responses simple and deferential. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir," he would murmur, all while his mind catalogued every detail of the plantation's security, every weakness in its systems, every opportunity that might present itself. What could a man trapped in bondage possibly be planning as he forged the very chains that held his people captive? It began with observation. Isaac noticed that every lock on the plantation, from the storage sheds to the quarters where enslaved people lived, from the tool cribs to the chains themselves, followed similar patterns. Master Thornhill bought his locks from the same locksmith in Natchez, a man who used 3 basic designs with minor variations. Over months of careful attention, Isaac memorized these patterns. He understood the mechanism of each lock as intimately as he understood the grain of steel, the temper of iron. The idea came to him slowly, not as a lightning bolt of inspiration, but as a sunrise, gradual and inevitable. If he could understand how locks worked, could he not also craft the keys to open them? And if he could craft keys, what doors might be opened? What chains might be broken? The thought was dangerous, thrilling, and terrifying all at once. Discovery would mean death, probably not just for him but for others as well. The masters did not tolerate resistance, and they made examples of those who dared to dream of freedom. But Isaac remembered his mother's words. "Your mind is yours alone." And he remembered something else she had told him before she died when he was 15, her body finally broken by years of relentless labor. With her last breaths, she had gripped his hand and whispered, "You have something special, Isaac, something that can help others. Don't waste it. Don't let them make you small." Those words had burned themselves into his soul, a brand more permanent than any iron could make. So Isaac began his secret work. It started small, almost insignificantly so. When crafting locks and chains during his regular duties, he would occasionally make an extra piece, a bit of metal that could be easily hidden, easily explained away as scrap if discovered. He developed techniques for working quietly, for timing his secret strikes with the regular rhythm of his legitimate work so that anyone listening would hear only the expected sounds of the forge. Late at night, long after the other enslaved people had collapsed into exhausted sleep, Isaac would lie awake in his small cabin, a carefully hidden piece of metal in his hands, feeling its shape, understanding its potential. He couldn't risk working at the forge after hours. The glow would be visible, the sound would carry. But he could plan, could visualize, could prepare himself mentally for the work ahead. The true breakthrough came during a summer storm, when lightning struck a tree near the quarters and split it in 2 with a sound like the world breaking apart. The storm lasted 3 days, unprecedented in its fury. Rain turned the plantation roads into rivers of mud. Work in the fields became impossible. Even Master Thornhill, usually demanding every possible hour of labor from his enslaved workforce, had to concede to the weather. People huddled in their cabins, listening to the wind howl and the thunder crash, wondering if this was the biblical flood returned to wash away the world and all its sins. Isaac saw opportunity in the chaos. The forge had a small side room where tools and materials were stored, a space barely larger than a closet. During the storm, with everyone sheltering and the master's family safe in the big house, Isaac volunteered to check the forge buildings for storm damage. "Don't want no tools getting rusted, master," he said in the simple, eager-to-please voice he had perfected over years. Thornhill, comfortable in his dry house, waved him away without a second thought. In the tool room, Isaac worked by the grey light filtering through gaps in the walls. He had smuggled in the small pieces of metal he had been collecting, along with a few simple files he had crafted and hidden. The thunder masked the sound of his filing. The rain concealed any smoke that might have risen from his work. For 3 days, in stolen moments, Isaac created his first key. A simple thing, crude compared to the work he could do at the proper forge, but functional. It was designed to open the locks on the storage shed where tools were kept overnight, tools that could be weapons, tools that could cut chains, tools that could dig tunnels or break through barriers. His hands trembled as he filed the final notch, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was creating. This was more than metal. It was possibility given form. It was hope made tangible. It was the first word in a language of liberation he was teaching himself to speak. But creating the key was only the first challenge. Using it without being discovered would be the true test of his courage and cunning. Isaac waited 2 full weeks after the storm before attempting to use the key. Patience, Jeremiah had taught him, was the blacksmith's greatest virtue. Rush the work and the metal breaks. Rush the plan and lives would be destroyed. So Isaac watched, observed, learned the patterns of the plantation's night routine. He noted when the overseer, a brutal man named Cyrus Marsh, made his rounds. He tracked which nights the master stayed up late drinking with neighbors and which nights he retired early. He observed the moon's cycles, understanding that the darkest nights provided the best cover, but also the greatest danger if one stumbled or made noise. On a moonless night in late August, when the air hung thick and heavy with humidity and the sounds of crickets and frogs created a blanket of noise that might mask his movements, Isaac finally made his attempt. He lay in his cabin, listening to the breathing of the other men who shared the small space, waiting until he was certain they slept deeply. Then, moving with the careful silence of a man whose life depended on not being heard, he slipped out into the darkness. The walk from the quarters to the tool shed took only 2 minutes in daylight, but Isaac made it last 20, pausing after every few steps to listen, to ensure no one was awake. No eyes watched from windows. No dogs had been roused by his movement. His heart hammered so hard in his chest he was certain it could be heard across the plantation. The key burned in his pocket like a hot coal, accusatory and promising all at once. When he finally reached the shed, his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the key while trying to insert it into the lock. He took a breath, forced himself to calm, remembered every lesson Jeremiah had ever taught him about steady hands and focused minds. The key slid home. He turned it, feeling the mechanism resist, then yield. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to Isaac as loud as a rifle shot, but was in reality barely a whisper. Inside the shed, illuminated only by starlight filtering through the gaps in the walls, lay an arsenal of possibility. Axes, saws, hammers, files, chisels, crowbars. Isaac didn't take anything on that first night. He simply stood there, breathing in the significance of what he had done. He had opened a lock without permission, had accessed something forbidden. It was a small act of rebellion, nearly meaningless in the grand scheme of the plantation's oppressive machinery, but to Isaac it represented something profound. He had proven that the systems designed to contain him were not as impenetrable as they wanted him to believe. If he could open one lock, he could open others. If he could access one forbidden space, he could access more. The architecture of his enslavement was not absolute. It had vulnerabilities, gaps, weaknesses that a clever man might exploit. Isaac relocked the shed, pocketed his key, and returned to his cabin, his mind racing with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. What Isaac didn't know was that someone had been watching him that night, and everything was about to change. The next morning dawned like any other, with the harsh clang of the bell that summoned enslaved workers to another day of unpaid labor. Isaac rose with the others, his body moving through the familiar routine while his mind replayed every moment of the previous night, searching for any mistake, any sign that he had been discovered. He found none. At breakfast, a meager portion of cornmeal mush, no one looked at him strangely. At the forge, Jeremiah greeted him as always, and the day's work began without incident. It wasn't until noon, when the sun had climbed to its merciless zenith and the forge burned like a portal to hell itself, that Isaac learned he was not as unobserved as he had believed. A woman named Clara, who worked in the master's house and was known for her sharp eyes and sharper wit, appeared at the forge door. She was carrying water for the workers, a common enough sight, but when she handed Isaac his dipper, her fingers brushed his palm in a deliberate way that made him look up at her face. "Some folks walk in the night," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the forge. "Some folks got business that needs tending in the dark. Some folks might want to know they ain't walking alone if they got sense enough to trust the right people." Isaac's blood ran cold. She knew. Somehow Clara had seen him, or knew someone who had. His hand tightened on the dipper, his mind racing through options. Deny, confess, run. Each choice carried its own dangers, its own potential for catastrophe. But Clara's eyes held no threat, no malice. Instead, they held something Isaac had rarely seen directed at him: respect, and perhaps a glimmer of hope. "There's others," she continued, speaking while pretending to adjust the bucket she carried. "Others who dream. Others who remember what freedom tastes like, even if they never had it themselves. Others who might be willing to help a man with the right kind of skills if that man was trustworthy enough to include them in his plans." Before Isaac could respond, before he could process the enormity of what Clara was suggesting, she was gone, moving on to bring water to the other workers. But her words echoed in Isaac's mind for the rest of the day, a promise and a threat and an invitation all tangled together. He was not alone in his dreaming. There were others who yearned for freedom, who might be willing to risk everything for even a chance at liberation. The question was whether Isaac was brave enough or foolish enough to trust them, and whether expanding his circle of conspirators would increase their chances or simply multiply the opportunities for betrayal and death. That night, Isaac didn't sleep. He lay in his cabin, staring at the darkness, weighing the impossible choice before him. Alone, his chances of escaping were slim. The plantation was miles from anywhere that might offer sanctuary. The surrounding countryside was hostile to runaways, filled with slave catchers, vigilantes, and sympathetic whites who would turn in a fleeing enslaved person for a reward or simply out of conviction that the social order must be maintained. Even if Isaac made it to freedom, he would be leaving behind everyone he had ever known, including the community that had raised him, the people who shared his suffering. But together, with others, the possibilities expanded even as the risks multiplied. A group could plan more comprehensively, could pool resources and knowledge, could provide mutual support and protection. Yet a group also meant more people who might break under pressure, who might betray the conspiracy either deliberately or through careless talk. The masters had centuries of experience in maintaining control through isolation, in preventing exactly the kind of collective action that Clara was suggesting. Isaac's mother's words came back to him again. "You have something special, Isaac. Something that can help others." Perhaps his gift with metal, his ability to craft keys and tools, was meant to be used not just for his own liberation, but for many. Perhaps his skills were meant to serve as a catalyst for something larger than himself. As dawn approached and the first birds began their morning songs, Isaac made his decision. But would it lead to freedom or to the gallows? The next few weeks moved slowly, each day heavy with unspoken tension. Isaac continued his work at the forge with his usual excellence, giving Master Thornhill no reason for suspicion. But beneath the surface, a careful dance of communication was taking place. Clara would appear with water, and in her presence, certain small signals would be exchanged. The position of the bucket, the number of times she wiped her brow, the particular way she greeted Jeremiah. These were codes developed over generations of enslaved people, languages of resistance that existed beneath the overseer's notice. Through these subtle communications, Isaac learned that Clara was part of a small network of people on the plantation who shared information, protected each other, and had been waiting for an opportunity, a catalyst, someone with the particular skills needed to transform hope into action. There was Samuel, a field hand who had escaped once before and been recaptured, who knew the surrounding territory and the locations of sympathetic free black communities in the north. There was Dinah, who worked alongside Clara in the big house and had access to information about the master's movements, when he would be away, when security might be laxest. There was Moses, an older man who served as a kind of spiritual leader for the enslaved community, whose words carried weight and whose blessing would be necessary for any major undertaking. Isaac was not invited to meet these people directly, not yet. Trust had to be earned slowly, carefully. One careless word, one person who cracked under the psychological torture of slavery, and everyone involved would be killed or sold away to even worse fates in the Deep South. So Isaac demonstrated his trustworthiness through action. He created another key, this one for the smokehouse where preserved meat was stored. He passed it to Clara through a dead drop, a hollow in a particular tree stump that both of them could access without being seen together. A week later, meat that should have been locked away appeared in the quarters, distributed to families who were always kept on the edge of starvation, never given quite enough to be truly strong. No one knew where the food came from. No one asked. But everyone understood that something had shifted, that someone was acting in their interest, that resistance was possible even under the master's supposedly all-seeing gaze. It was through these small acts that Isaac built trust, proved himself worthy of being included in something larger. And finally, 2 months after that first night, when he had opened the tool shed, Isaac received an invitation. Clara approached the forge, and this time her message was direct. Sunday night, after midnight, the old oak near the creek. Come alone. Tell no one. Sunday was the one day when enslaved people were given a few hours of rest, when religious services were allowed, when the rigid control of the plantation's work schedule loosened just slightly. It was also the day when secret meetings could occur with slightly less risk of discovery. Isaac agreed with a barely perceptible nod, and the die was cast. But gathering to plan escape was one thing. Actually, achieving freedom would require a miracle or a level of strategic genius that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Sunday night arrived wrapped in clouds that obscured the stars, a darkness so complete that Isaac had to feel his way toward the meeting place more than see it. The old oak was enormous, ancient, its roots creating natural seats and hiding places. As Isaac approached, he heard the low murmur of voices and saw the faintest glow of a carefully shielded lantern. His heart raced. This was the moment of truth. He was either about to become part of something revolutionary, or he was walking into a trap that would end his life. "Isaac," a voice called softly. It was Moses, the elder. "Come, son, we've been waiting for you." Isaac stepped into the circle of dim light and saw 6 faces looking back at him. Moses, Clara, Samuel, Dinah, and 2 others he knew by sight but had never spoken to. A woman named Sarah who worked in the dairy, and a young man named Thomas who tended the master's horses. All of them were risking everything simply by being there, by daring to gather and discuss their situation, rather than accepting it as God's will, as the masters insisted they should. Moses spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through 60 years of bondage. "We've watched you, Isaac. Watched how you work, how you think, how you move. We see something in you that we haven't seen in a long time, the spark of possibility. Clara tells us you've been crafting keys, opening locks. That true?" There was no point in denial. Isaac nodded. "Yes, sir. I made keys for the tool shed and the smokehouse. I've been studying the locks on the chains, on the quarters, on the storerooms. I believe I can craft keys for almost any lock on this plantation." The group exchanged glances, a mixture of excitement and fear rippling through them like wind through wheat. Samuel leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Can you make enough keys for all of us? Can you make them without the master knowing?" "I can," Isaac said, though his confidence was partially a bluff. He believed he could, but he had never attempted anything on such a scale. "But keys alone won't get us free. We need a plan. We need to know where we're going, how we'll survive once we leave, how we'll avoid the slave catchers." For the next 2 hours, speaking in hushed voices while keeping watch for any signs of discovery, the group shared what they knew. Samuel described his previous escape attempt, the mistakes he had made, the routes he had learned. He spoke of the Underground Railroad, a network of free black people and sympathetic whites who provided shelter and guidance to those fleeing enslavement, though its routes were closely guarded secrets, and finding its stations required knowledge and luck. Dinah reported on the master's schedule. Thornhill had business in Natchez that would take him away for 3 days in October, and he planned to bring the overseer Marsh with him, leaving the plantation under the supervision of his son, a man more interested in drinking than in maintaining rigid discipline. Those 3 days might represent the best opportunity they would ever have. Clara talked about supplies, what could be taken without causing immediate alarm, how to prepare food that would last for a journey, what tools and materials would be most useful. Sarah spoke about the dogs that would be used to hunt them if their escape was discovered too quickly, and ways to throw the animals off their scent. Thomas described the geography of the surrounding area, the rivers and roads, the settlements both friendly and hostile. And through it all, Moses provided the moral framework, the spiritual justification for what they were planning. "The masters say God wants us in chains," he told them, his eyes reflecting the lantern light. "They say the Bible commands us to obey, to accept our lot, to be content with suffering. But I've read that Bible myself, and I see a different God. I see a God who freed slaves from Egypt, who broke chains, who promised liberty to the captive. Our freedom isn't theft from the masters, it's taking back what God intended for us from the beginning." As the meeting came to a close, the plan taking shape in their collective imagination, Isaac felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. These people were trusting him with their lives. His keys, his skills, his ability to forge the tools of liberation would be central to everything they attempted. If he failed, if he made a mistake, if his craftsmanship was not up to the task, people would die or face fates worse than death. But as he looked around the circle, seeing the hope kindled in eyes that had been dulled by years of brutality and dehumanization, Isaac knew he could not turn back now. The work ahead would be dangerous, meticulous, and exhausting, but it was also necessary. It was the purpose for which he had been training his entire life, even if he hadn't fully understood it until this moment. The question now was whether Isaac's genius at the forge could be translated into the keys that would unlock not just doors and chains, but the door to freedom itself, and whether any of them would live long enough to walk through it. The months that followed were the most intense of Isaac's life. On the surface, everything continued as normal. He worked at the forge during the day, crafting the chains and locks and tools that maintained the plantation's operations. He kept his head down, his responses simple, his demeanor that of a man who had fully internalized his enslaved status. But in the hidden hours, in the stolen moments, Isaac was engaged in the most important work of his life. He began creating keys with systematic precision. Each lock on the plantation had been catalogued in his mind, its mechanism understood, its vulnerabilities identified. Now, he had to translate that mental knowledge into physical keys, each one crafted to perfection. Because a key that almost worked was worse than no key at all. It would raise suspicions, alert the masters that something was wrong, potentially doom the entire conspiracy. The challenge was doing this work in absolute secrecy. Isaac couldn't spend suspicious amounts of time at the forge after hours. He couldn't accumulate visible quantities of scrap metal. Every aspect of his secret project had to be hidden within his legitimate work, camouflaged so perfectly that even Jeremiah, who worked beside him every day, wouldn't notice anything amiss. Isaac developed techniques of incredible subtlety. When crafting a chain during the day, he would occasionally create an extra link, slightly smaller than required, that he would then set aside as if it were defective. When filing a lock housing, he would collect the metal filings and press them together, eventually creating small, workable pieces. He learned to work during the noisiest parts of the day, when his hammering on secret projects would be masked by the regular rhythm of the forge. He hid his works in progress in places no one would think to look. Inside the hollow handle of a broken hammer, beneath a loose floorboard in the tool room, inside a crack in the forge's foundation. Slowly, painfully slowly, a collection of keys began to take shape. Keys for the tool shed, the smokehouse, the quarters, the chains themselves. Each one had to be tested, but testing meant risk. Isaac would wait for opportunities, moments when he was sent to fetch tools, brief periods when he was unsupervised. He would test a key, memorize what needed adjustment, then return to his secret modifications. But the physical challenge of creating the keys was matched by the psychological burden of living with the constant fear of discovery. And that weight was beginning to show in ways Isaac hadn't anticipated. He began having nightmares, vivid dreams in which he was discovered, dragged before the master, beaten until he revealed the names of all his co-conspirators. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing, his hands trembling. During the day, he found himself jumping at sudden sounds, overanalyzing every glance from the overseer, every casual comment from the master. The stress was eating at him from the inside, eroding his calm even as he maintained his outward composure. Clara noticed first. She appeared at the forge one afternoon and found Isaac's hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold his hammer steady. "You carrying too much," she said quietly, pretending to adjust the water bucket. "You trying to bear this alone, and it's breaking you, remember? We're in this together. You don't have to shoulder everything yourself." Her words helped, but the fundamental problem remained. Isaac was the linchpin of the entire plan. Without his keys, without his skills, the conspiracy would collapse. That knowledge created a pressure that was almost unbearable, a constant voice in his head asking what would happen if he failed, if his work wasn't good enough, if his courage faltered at the critical moment. It was during this period of intense stress that Isaac made a discovery that would change everything. One evening, while working late at the forge with permission to finish an urgent project for the master, Isaac was examining a particularly complex lock that Thornhill had purchased recently for the plantation's main gate. It was a new design, more sophisticated than the standard locks Isaac had been studying. As he disassembled it to understand its mechanism, he found something unexpected. A manufacturer's mark stamped inside and beneath it, in tiny letters, a defect code. Isaac's hands froze. He stared at those tiny markings, and suddenly a cascade of realizations flooded through his mind. This lock, like every manufactured lock, had been made in quantity, probably hundreds or thousands produced from the same molds and patterns. And if this one had a defect code, that meant the manufacturer knew it had weaknesses, vulnerabilities that a knowledgeable person could exploit. Isaac had been approaching each lock as a unique challenge, but what if they were all variations on a few standard designs, all sharing similar weaknesses? He spent the next week in a fever of investigation, examining every lock he could access, looking for manufacturer's marks, comparing designs, searching for patterns. What he discovered was revolutionary. The locks that bound his people were not unbreakable mechanisms forged by master craftsmen. They were mass-produced items, made as cheaply as possible while still being functional, designed to be profitable rather than perfect. And in their very standardization lay their greatest vulnerability. Isaac realized he didn't need to craft a unique key for every single lock on the plantation. He needed to craft only a handful of master keys, each designed to exploit the common weaknesses in the standard lock designs. It was genius born of desperation, insight emerging from the pressure of impossible expectations. But could he actually execute this vision? Or was he overreaching, gambling with lives on an untested theory? Isaac threw himself into the work with renewed energy. The psychological burden that had been crushing him suddenly felt lighter, because he now had a clear path forward, a strategy that seemed actually achievable rather than impossibly daunting. He began crafting what he thought of as his master keys, each one designed to exploit the common vulnerabilities he had identified in the manufactured locks. The first master key was designed for the standard padlocks used throughout the plantation on storerooms, sheds, and chains. These locks all shared a similar internal mechanism, with slight variations. Isaac's key incorporated adjustable elements, tiny metal pieces that could be shifted slightly to accommodate the minor differences between individual locks. It was more complex than a standard key, requiring knowledge to use properly. But once someone understood the principle, a single key could open dozens of locks. The second master key was for the door locks on the quarters and work buildings. These were simpler mechanisms, but they were also used more frequently and therefore needed to be picked more carefully to avoid detection. Isaac's key for these locks was elegant in its simplicity, a tool that could be used quickly and quietly. The third was perhaps his most ambitious creation, a key that could open the chains themselves, the shackles that were sometimes used to restrain people being punished or to secure those deemed flight risks during transport. These locks were supposedly the most secure, the ones that symbolized the absolute power of the masters over the bodies of the enslaved. But Isaac had studied them obsessively, and he had found their weakness. The shackle locks all used a specific type of pin tumbler mechanism, and Isaac created a pick that could manipulate those pins from the outside, essentially turning the lock against itself. Testing these master keys was nerve-wracking. Isaac had to wait for perfect moments, times when he could briefly access a lock without being observed, when he had a legitimate reason for being near a particular building or storage area. Each successful test was a small triumph, but also a reminder of how much could go wrong. A key that stuck, a lock that resisted, even a moment too long spent fumbling with a mechanism, any of these could draw attention and doom them all. As September turned to October and the date of Master Thornhill's trip to Natchez approached, Isaac completed his set of master keys. He had 3 tools that could potentially open every lock on the plantation, plus several specialized picks and files that could be used for stubborn mechanisms. He had tested them as thoroughly as he dared, and they worked. The work that had seemed impossible just months ago was now complete, but having the keys was only one piece of the puzzle. The group still needed a comprehensive plan for the escape itself, a strategy that would get all 7 of them off the plantation and onto the Underground Railroad before the alarm was raised and the slave catchers were set loose. The final planning meeting took place 1 week before Thornhill's departure. Once again beneath the old oak tree, once again under the cover of darkness and with careful watches posted. Isaac brought his master keys, carefully wrapped in cloth, and laid them out for the group to see. There was a moment of awed silence as people looked at these small pieces of metal that represented so much hope, so much danger, so much possibility. "These can open every lock on this plantation," Isaac explained, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The storerooms, the quarters, the chains. With these, we can access supplies, tools, anything we need. We can free ourselves from any restraint. But we have to be smart about how we use them. Every lock we open is a risk. Every door we go through is a chance to be discovered. Samuel took one of the keys, turning it over in his calloused hands with something approaching reverence. "How do they work?" he asked. "What if something goes wrong?" Isaac spent the next hour teaching them the basics of lock mechanisms, showing them how to insert the keys, how to feel for resistance, how to make tiny adjustments. It was a crash course in a skill that had taken him years to develop. But he tried to convey the essential knowledge, the critical understanding that might mean the difference between success and failure. Then they turned to the plan itself. Thornhill would leave on a Wednesday morning. They would wait until Thursday night, giving themselves one full day to ensure he was truly gone and not returning unexpectedly. During Thursday they would each prepare in small ways, gathering food, hiding supplies in predetermined locations, making sure they were rested and ready. Thursday night, after midnight, when even the most vigilant overseer's son would be asleep, they would make their move. Isaac would use his keys to access the smokehouse and take preserved meat, beans, cornmeal, enough food for 7 people for at least a week. Samuel and Thomas would go to the tool shed and take what they needed: knives for protection, an axe for clearing paths, rope, blankets. Clara, Dinah, and Sarah would collect water containers, medical supplies from the big house where Dinah had access, warm clothing. Moses would prepare spiritual items, a Bible he had hidden away, though it was illegal for enslaved people to read, and small tokens that might provide comfort during the terrifying journey ahead. They would meet at the northern edge of the plantation, near a break in the fence that Samuel had been gradually weakening over the past weeks. From there, they would follow a route Samuel had mapped out during his previous escape attempt, heading northeast toward the Ohio River and the Free States beyond. It would be a journey of at least 200 miles through hostile territory, with every white person a potential threat and every noise in the darkness a possible slave catcher. The plan was ambitious, dangerous, and probably doomed to failure. But it was a plan, and it was their only chance. As the meeting broke up and the conspirators scattered back to their cabins, each of them carried the weight of what was about to happen. In 1 week, they would either be free or dead, and there would be no middle ground, no half measures, no turning back. Isaac returned to his cabin, his mind churning with final details, backup plans, worst-case scenarios. But beneath it all was a strange calm he hadn't felt in months. The work was done. The keys were crafted. The plan was set. Now it was just a matter of execution and courage, and whether the universe that had so long been set against them might finally offer a sliver of mercy. But what none of them knew was that betrayal was already taking shape, and their carefully laid plans were about to be tested in ways they could never have imagined. The week before the escape passed with agonizing slowness. Every morning when Isaac woke, he had to resist the urge to check on his hidden keys, to verify they were still safely concealed. Every interaction with Master Thornhill or the overseer felt fraught with danger, as if his guilt and intention were written across his face in letters too large to ignore. He noticed the others struggling similarly, Clara's usual composure occasionally cracking into nervous gestures, Samuel's eyes constantly scanning for threats, Moses seeming to age years in just days under the psychological burden. Wednesday morning finally arrived. Master Thornhill and Cyrus Marsh loaded their wagon, preparing for the journey to Natchez. Isaac watched from the forge, forcing himself to maintain his usual rhythm of work while his heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The plan was in motion, and there was no way to call it back, no way to undo what they had set in motion. Thornhill stopped by the forge before departing, as he sometimes did, to give Isaac instructions for maintaining equipment during his absence. "You keep things running smooth," Thornhill said. his hand on Isaac's shoulder in that possessive gesture that always made Isaac's skin crawl. "Don't want to come back to broken tools and backed-up work, you understand?" "Yes, sir," Isaac responded, eyes down, voice servile. "I'll keep everything working good, sir." Thornhill nodded, satisfied, and departed. Within an hour, the wagon carrying him and Marsh disappeared down the Plantation road, heading toward town and business and a slave labor economy built on stolen lives and unpaid toil. The plantation's atmosphere shifted immediately, tension released like a taut string being cut. The master's son, a young man named Wesley Thornhill, who was barely 20 and more interested in gambling and drinking than in running a plantation, made a perfunctory appearance to establish his authority, then retreated to the main house and was not seen again. Isaac and his co-conspirators spent Wednesday in a state of barely contained, nervous energy. They went through the motions of their assigned work, but their minds were already on the night ahead, on the journey they were about to undertake, on the freedom that seemed suddenly, impossibly close. But as Wednesday evening approached, something happened that no one had anticipated. A wagon arrived at the plantation, and from it stepped a man Isaac had never seen before. A professional slave catcher, recognizable by his equipment. Dogs on chains, a rifle, a hard-eyed look that spoke of violence as a profession rather than just a tool. And with him, looking terrified and beaten, was a young enslaved man from a neighboring plantation who had attempted escape the previous week and been recaptured. The slave catcher spoke with Wesley Thornhill for several minutes, while the captured man stood trembling, knowing what was coming. Then Wesley ordered all the enslaved people on the plantation to gather in front of the main house. This was standard procedure when someone was recaptured. The masters believed in making examples, in using spectacular cruelty to terrorize others into submission. Isaac stood with the others, his stomach churning with horror and disgust, as the slave catcher prepared to administer a public whipping. But just before the first blow fell, the captured young man did something unexpected. He looked directly at Isaac, and in his eyes was a message, a warning, a desperate attempt to communicate something urgent. "They know," the young man suddenly shouted, his voice hoarse. "They know about the conspiracies. They know someone's planning escapes. They're watching. His words were cut off by the crack of a whip and his scream of pain, but the damage was done. The message had been delivered. Someone, somewhere had talked or been careless. The masters were aware that escape plans were being formed, that resistance was being organized. They didn't know specifics yet. If they did, Isaac and his friends would already be in chains, but they were suspicious, vigilant, preparing. The implications crashed through Isaac's mind like thunder. Their plan for tomorrow night might already be compromised. Every move they made from this point forward would be under increased scrutiny. The window of opportunity they had counted on might already be closing. And somewhere, among the people Isaac had trusted, or among those they had tried to keep ignorant for their own safety, there might be an informant, someone whose fear or hope for reward had led them to whisper to the masters about plans they had overheard. As the brutal display continued and the gathered enslaved people were forced to watch, Isaac made eye contact with Clara, then Samuel, then Moses. In those glances an entire conversation occurred. Do we abort? Do we proceed? Has everything been for nothing? The risk had just multiplied exponentially, but so had the stakes. Because now, if they didn't escape, it was only a matter of time before the master's suspicions focused on them specifically, and then interrogation, torture, and death would follow as inevitably as dawn follows darkness. When the horrific spectacle finally ended and people were released back to their cabins, Isaac didn't go to sleep. He sat in the darkness, his mind racing through calculations and scenarios. The sensible thing would be to abort, to destroy the keys, to disperse and pretend nothing had ever been planned. But sensible had never led to freedom. Sensible had kept people in chains for generations. And somewhere in Isaac's chest, Beneath the fear and the calculation was a flame that refused to be extinguished. The flame his mother had kindled, the flame Jeremiah had helped him keep burning, the flame that insisted he was meant for something more than passive acceptance of his dehumanization. By the time first light began to stain the eastern sky, Isaac had made his decision. They would proceed with the plan tonight as scheduled, but with modifications. They would move earlier than originally planned, before midnight instead of after. They would skip the lengthy preparation they had envisioned, taking only what could be grabbed quickly. And they would have to move fast and far, because once the escape was discovered, the hunt would be intense, focused, and probably successful, unless they could reach the Underground Railroad's protection before the slave catchers caught their scent. But first, Isaac had to communicate this change to the others without being observed, without giving away that anything was happening. It would require all the subtlety, all the covert communication skills that enslaved people had developed over centuries of resistance. And it would require one more visit to the forge, one more use of his skills to create something that might make the difference between freedom and death. The question was whether Isaac had the courage to see this through, now that the danger had intensified beyond anything they had imagined. Thursday passed in a fog of tension so thick, Isaac felt he could barely breathe. He worked at the forge, his hands moving through familiar motions, while his mind was entirely elsewhere. He needed to reach the others, to tell them about the accelerated timeline, to make sure everyone understood that tonight was happening whether they felt ready or not. But Wesley Thornhill, perhaps acting on his father's instructions, or perhaps on instinct, had ordered the overseer's assistants to keep close watch on the enslaved population today. There were more eyes than usual, more random checks of the quarters, more supervision of movement. Isaac used the only communication channel available to him, the water bucket. When Clara appeared at midday with her usual delivery, Isaac accepted the water and in doing so, traced a quick pattern on her palm with his finger. It was a simple code, one they had practiced but never yet used. Tonight, earlier, be ready. Clara's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, but she nodded and moved on. The afternoon stretched interminably. Isaac could feel his nerves beginning to fray, could sense that he was close to making a mistake that would reveal everything. To steady himself, he focused on his craft, on the meditative quality of working metal. He spent the afternoon creating one final tool, not a key this time, but a small, sharp knife that could be hidden in a boot or sleeve. He made 7 of them, small weapons that might be useful for cutting rope, defending against an attack, or simply providing psychological comfort. These he concealed in a cloth bundle that he would bring to the meeting point. As evening fell, Isaac cleaned the forge with meticulous care, giving himself an excuse to remain there later than usual. Jeremiah had already retired to his cabin, exhausted from the day's work. Isaac waited until full darkness had settled, until the sounds of the plantation had quieted to the nocturnal chorus of crickets and frogs. Then, moving with the careful silence of a man whose life depended on not being heard, he retrieved his hidden keys, his crafted knives, and began the most dangerous journey of his life. The meeting point was the northern fence line, a quarter-mile from the nearest cabin. Isaac approached it from an indirect route, pausing frequently to listen, to make sure no patrol had been established, no trap had been set. His heart hammered so hard, he was certain it could be heard across the plantation. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed like a shout of alarm. When he finally reached the fence, he found the others already there, huddled in the darkness like ghosts. 7 souls preparing to risk everything for the chance to be treated as human beings rather than property. Samuel had already weakened the fence as planned, and the gap was large enough for them to slip through one at a time. The supplies they had managed to gather were pitifully meager, some food, a few tools, inadequate clothing for the journey ahead. But it was all they had, all they could carry, all the plantation would relinquish. "Everyone ready?" Moses whispered, his voice carrying the weight of spiritual authority, even in this moment of profound earthly danger. One by one they nodded. Sarah was crying silently, terror and hope warring in her eyes. Thomas kept checking over his shoulder, certain that at any moment the alarm would be raised. But Clara's face was set with determination, and Samuel's eyes held the steely resolve of someone who had already tasted freedom once and would do anything to taste it again. Isaac distributed his small knives, showed them how to conceal the weapons, how to use them if necessary. Then he took out his master keys and held them up in the dim starlight. "These got us this far," he said quietly. "These keys opened every lock between us and this moment. But from here on, we make our own way. We open the locks on our own futures, with our own hands, with our own courage." It was time. The moment of truth had arrived. 7 people, armed with improvised weapons, stolen food, and an enslaved blacksmith's genius, were about to attempt the impossible. They would either die as free people or live long enough to know what it meant to be human rather than property. Samuel went through the fence first, his body slipping into the darkness beyond the plantation's borders. Then Dinah, then Sarah, then Thomas. Clara paused before going through, turned to Isaac and whispered, "Thank you. Whatever happens, thank you for believing we could do this." Then she was gone, and it was just Isaac and Moses at the fence. The old man gripped Isaac's arm with surprising strength. "Your mama would be proud," he said. "You didn't just craft keys, son. You crafted hope. You reminded us that we're not what they say we are. Whatever happens tonight, that matters." Moses went through the fence. Isaac took one last look back at the plantation, at the forge where he had learned his craft, at the quarters where he had lived his entire life, at the system of oppression that had tried to reduce him to a thing rather than a person. Then he slipped through the gap in the fence, and for the first time in his life, Isaac stood on soil where he was not property. The sensation was overwhelming, terrifying, and glorious all at once. The group moved quickly into the tree line, following the route Samuel had memorized. They would head northeast, staying off roads, moving through forest and field, using the North Star as their guide. The first goal was to put as many miles as possible between themselves and the plantation before dawn, when their absence would be discovered and the hunt would begin. For the first few miles everything went smoothly. The forest provided cover, the darkness provided concealment, and the sheer exhilaration of what they were doing gave them energy that overcame exhaustion. They moved in single file, Samuel leading, Isaac bringing up the rear, constantly listening for sounds of pursuit. But around midnight, disaster struck. They were crossing a small stream when Thomas, perhaps dizzy from stress and lack of sleep, stumbled and fell hard against a rock. The sound of his cry of pain was like a gunshot in the quiet night. Worse, when the others rushed to help him, they discovered his ankle was badly twisted, possibly broken. He could barely stand, much less walk the 100+ miles they had ahead of them. This was a scenario they had discussed but hoped never to face. Carrying Thomas would slow them dramatically, possibly fatally. Leaving him behind would mean he'd be captured and tortured until he revealed where the others had gone. There was no good choice, only impossible ones. "Leave me," Thomas gasped, his face contorted with pain. "I'll tell them I escaped alone, that I don't know where you went. Just go. Please." But Clara was already tearing cloth from her skirt to bind his ankle, and Samuel was fashioning a rough crutch from a fallen branch. "We don't leave people behind," Clara said firmly. "That's what they do. We're not them." They helped Thomas to his feet, supported him between Samuel and Moses, and continued moving. But their pace had been cut by more than half, and with every labored step, Isaac could feel their chances of successful escape diminishing. They would not make it to the first underground railroad station by dawn. They might not even make it out of the county. As the sky began to lighten with the approach of sunrise, Isaac heard it, the sound he had been dreading. Far behind them, but unmistakable, dogs barking, The baying of hounds on a scent trail. The slave catchers had been unleashed, and they were coming. The fugitives looked at each other with eyes wide with terror. They had maybe an hour's head start, probably less. The dogs would overtake them long before they reached any kind of sanctuary. Everything they had planned, everything they had risked, everything Isaac had crafted and created, it was all about to be for nothing unless they could somehow outwit professional hunters with animals bred specifically for tracking escaped humans. Isaac's mind raced through possibilities. They could split up, but that would just mean 7 separate captures instead of 1 group capture. They could try to hide, but the dogs would find them. They could stand and fight, but they were armed with pocket knives against men with rifles. Every option was bad. Then Isaac remembered something from his childhood. A story his mother had told him about how enslaved people in the swamps of Louisiana had evaded slave catchers. It was a long shot, probably wouldn't work, but it was the only chance they had. "We need to reach running water," Isaac said urgently. "A river or a creek, something with current. Dogs can't track scent through moving water. If we can get into a stream and move downstream far enough, we might break the trail." "The nearest river is 3 miles north," Samuel said, his voice strained. "Can we make it?" They didn't have a choice. They had to try. With renewed urgency born of desperation, the group pushed forward, practically carrying Thomas between them. The sounds of the dogs grew closer, the baying more excited as the animals closed the distance. Isaac could picture them. Massive hounds, trained to view black people as prey, their handlers right behind them with rifles and chains, and the absolute confidence that they would capture their quarry because they always did. The group burst out of the tree line, and there, glinting in the early morning light, was salvation and possibility in the form of a river, its waters running swift and deep from recent rains. Without hesitation, they plunged in, gasping at the shock of cold water, struggling against the current. Isaac looked back and saw the dogs emerging from the trees perhaps a quarter-mile behind them, with 3 mounted men right behind. "Downstream!" Samuel shouted. "Stay in the water, move downstream." They half waded, half swam, the current helping to carry them along, but also threatening to sweep them away entirely. The water was murky, the bottom treacherous with rocks and hidden debris. Sarah went under briefly, came up sputtering and terrified. But they kept moving, kept fighting the current and their own exhaustion, and the fear that threatened to overwhelm them. Behind them, the dogs reached the riverbank and went into a frenzy, running back and forth along the shore, having lost the scent trail in the water. The slave catchers shouted at each other, arguments about which direction the fugitives had gone, whether to split up, whether to continue downstream or search upstream. The group kept moving, letting the current carry them, putting distance between themselves and the hunters. Minutes passed that felt like hours. The cold water numbed their limbs. The effort of staying afloat while also trying to support Thomas drained their remaining energy. But still they persisted, because the alternative was chains and torture, and the death of hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 30 minutes, Samuel spotted something ahead. A small wooden dock extending into the river, and beyond it, a modest cabin. As they drew closer, Isaac saw something that made his heart leap. A quilt, hanging from the cabin's porch, its pattern a specific design he had heard whispered about in the quarters. It was a signal, a marker used by the Underground Railroad to identify safe houses, places where fugitives from slavery could find temporary refuge. They had, by luck and providence and sheer desperate will, stumbled directly onto a station of the network they had been trying to reach. The question was whether the person living there would actually help them, or whether this was a trap, or whether the slave catchers would arrive before they could reach the door. With the last of their strength, the group pulled themselves out of the river and staggered toward the cabin. Before they could knock, the door opened, and a black woman in her 60s stood there, her eyes taking in their condition with a single swift glance. "Lord have mercy," she said. "Get inside, now. You got hunters behind you?" "Yes, ma'am," Samuel gasped. "Maybe 10, 15 minutes back." The woman, who later introduced herself as Harriet but gave no last name, moved with impressive speed for her age. She pulled them into the cabin, directed them to a hidden cellar beneath the floorboards, handed them blankets and water. "You stay quiet no matter what you hear," she instructed. "I'll handle anyone who comes asking questions." As Isaac descended into the dark cellar with the others, as he heard the floorboards being replaced above them, as the reality of their narrow escape began to sink in, he felt something that had been locked away inside him for his entire life, beginning to break free. They weren't safe yet. They weren't even close to truly free. But they had survived this far, and that itself was a victory of sorts. In the darkness of that cellar, holding his master keys that had served their purpose, but would no longer be needed in quite the same way, Isaac whispered a prayer of thanks to his mother who had taught him to dream, to Jeremiah who had taught him craft and caution, to his companions who had trusted him enough to risk everything. They had forged their own freedom, had opened locks no one thought could be opened. But the journey was far from over, and the next chapter of their story was about to begin in ways none of them could have anticipated. Hours passed in the cellar's darkness. The group huddled together, listening to every sound from above, every footstep on the porch, every voice raised in conversation. At one point they heard exactly what they feared, the heavy boots of multiple men, the aggressive barking of dogs, voices demanding to search the property. Harriet's voice came through clearly, calm but firm. "This is a free state, and this is my property. You got no jurisdiction here, and you ain't coming in my house without proper authority." Arguments followed, threats were made, but Harriet stood her ground. The laws were complex in these border regions, places where slavery and freedom existed in uneasy proximity. Technically, the slave catchers had no legal right to search her home without going through proper channels, and Harriet knew it. She used that knowledge like a weapon, wielding the law against men who were used to operating above it. Eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, the men left. Their departure was grudging, accompanied by threats to return with the proper authorities. But they left, and in the cellar, 7 people allowed themselves to breathe again, to hope that maybe, possibly, they had actually escaped. When Harriet finally opened the cellar door, full night had fallen again. An entire day had passed in that hidden space. She brought food, simple fare but more than they had eaten in days, and medical supplies for Thomas's ankle. As they ate, she explained their situation. "You're in Indiana now," she told them. "Technically free soil, but that don't mean you're safe. There's plenty of folks here who sympathize with the slavers, who'll turn you in for a reward or just because they think it's right. And if they get proper papers from a judge, they can come back and search my place legal-like. So you can't stay here long." "Where do we go?" Clara asked, her voice exhausted but still determined. Harriet pulled out a worn map, marked with pencil notations and coded symbols. "You follow the route I'm going to show you. There's stations every 15-20 miles, people who will hide you, feed you, help you along. You travel at night, stay hidden during the day. You keep moving north until you reach Canada. That's true freedom, where no slave catcher can touch you, where the laws can't send you back. Canada." The word hung in the air like a dream, like a destination so distant it might as well be on another continent. It was hundreds of miles away, weeks of dangerous travel through territory where any white face might mean capture and return to horrors worse than death. But it was possible. Other people had made that journey, and with the Underground Railroad's help, maybe they could too. Over the next few days, staying hidden in Harriet's cabin while Thomas's ankle healed enough for travel, Isaac and his companions learned about the network that was helping them. The Underground Railroad was not a physical railroad, but a series of safe houses, hidden routes, and brave people, both black and white, who risked everything to help those fleeing slavery. Some were motivated by religious conviction, others by moral outrage at the institution of slavery, still others by their own experiences with oppression and dehumanization. Harriet herself was a formerly enslaved woman who had escaped 20 years earlier and had dedicated her life since then to helping others find freedom. Her home had sheltered hundreds of fugitives, and she maintained it through a combination of subsistence farming and donations from abolitionist societies. She knew the routes, the safe houses, the people who could be trusted and those who could not. She was, in many ways, as much a general in the war against slavery as any armed soldier, though her battlefield was measured in human lives saved rather than enemy casualties. During those days of waiting and healing, Isaac had time to reflect on everything that had happened. The keys he had crafted had opened physical locks, yes. But more than that, they had opened something in himself and in his companions. A door to the possibility of self-determination, of choosing their own path, rather than having it dictated by masters who viewed them as property. The skills Jeremiah had taught him, the lessons his mother had instilled, the careful observation and strategic thinking he had developed, all of these had come together in the creation of those keys, and those keys had, in turn, unlocked a future none of them had dared to dream possible just months ago. But Isaac also understood that the keys were symbols of a larger truth. Freedom was not something that could be simply unlocked and walked through like a door. It was something that had to be continuously fought for, continuously protected, continuously reimagined. The chains that bound people were not just physical iron, but psychological conditioning, legal structures, economic systems, social prejudices. Breaking one set of chains was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward true liberation. When Thomas could walk again, though with a pronounced limp that would stay with him the rest of his life, Harriet declared it was time for them to move on. She provided them with better supplies, warmer clothing, and detailed instructions for reaching the next station on the Underground Railroad. She also gave them something more valuable than any physical resource. She gave them hope, born of her own experience and the experiences of the hundreds she had helped. That the journey was possible, that Canada was real, that freedom was not just a dream, but an achievable destination. On a cold October night, under a sky full of stars that seemed to Isaac like the eyes of his ancestors watching over them, the group said goodbye to Harriet and set out once more. The journey ahead would be long and dangerous, but they faced it with something they hadn't possessed before. The knowledge that they were not alone, that a network of people stretched out before them like a human chain, pulling them toward freedom. As they walked through the darkness, following the North Star, Isaac felt the weight of the keys in his pocket. He had carried them all this way, these pieces of metal that had made their escape possible. Soon, he thought, he would no longer need them. Soon, the only locks he would encounter would be ones he chose to engage with, and the keys he carried would be metaphorical rather than literal. Keys of knowledge, of skill, of self-determination. But that future was not yet here. There were still miles to travel, still dangers to face, still the very real possibility that they might be captured and returned to slavery. So Isaac put one foot in front of the other, staying close to his companions, keeping watch for threats and carrying forward the dream that had started in a forge in Mississippi and was now leading him toward a destiny he could barely imagine. The journey north continued for 3 more weeks. A brutal test of endurance, courage, and trust. They moved from station to station, hiding in barns and cellars, traveling through forests and along riverbanks, always staying off the main roads where patrols might spot them. The Underground Railroad's conductors passed them along like precious cargo, each one taking responsibility for guiding them to the next safe point. They encountered close calls that stopped Isaac's heart. A patrol that passed within feet of their hiding place, a suspicious storekeeper who seemed too interested in the group of black travelers, a river crossing that nearly drowned them all when the current proved stronger than expected. Each time, they survived through a combination of luck, the wisdom of their guides, and their own desperate determination. The group changed during that journey. Thomas, despite his injury, became their scout, his limp actually providing cover as he could move through towns more openly, appearing to be a disabled freedman rather than a fugitive. Clara revealed a gift for interacting with white abolitionists, her dignified bearing and articulate speech challenging their preconceptions and earning their aid. Samuel's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable again and again. Sarah discovered a talent for foraging, finding food in the forest that kept them alive when supplies ran low. Dinah's medical knowledge, learned from years of caring for sick people in the plantation's quarters, kept them healthy, despite the hardships of the journey. Moses remained their spiritual center, leading them in quiet prayer when despair threatened to overwhelm them. And Isaac? Isaac became the keeper of their story, the one who remembered every detail of their journey, every person who helped them, every obstacle they overcame. He understood that if they made it to freedom, if they survived to tell this tale, it would be important that the world knew not just that they had escaped, but how they had done it. The ingenuity, the courage, the complex network of resistance that had made their liberation possible, these things needed to be remembered, needed to be passed down, needed to be understood as evidence that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents in their own liberation. As November arrived and the cold deepened, they finally crossed into Canada. The moment was anticlimactic and profound all at once. There was no physical marker, no line painted on the ground, no sign announcing they had reached free soil. But their guide, an elderly white man who had been helping fugitives for 30 years, stopped at a particular point on the road and turned to them with tears in his eyes. "This is it," he said simply. "You're in Canada. You're free." The word, free, hung in the air like something tangible, something Isaac could almost reach out and touch. Free. After 28 years of being property, of being owned, of having every aspect of his life controlled by others, he was free. They all were. The reactions were varied and deeply personal. Moses fell to his knees and prayed, his voice breaking with emotion. Clara and Dinah embraced, sobbing with relief and disbelief. Samuel stood very still, his face a mask of concentration, as if he was trying to memorize this exact moment, to burn it into his memory so thoroughly that no one could ever take it away. Thomas laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that mixed joy and trauma and release. Sarah simply sat down in the road and cried, great heaving sobs that seemed to contain every tear she had not been allowed to cry during years of bondage. Isaac pulled out his keys one more time, these pieces of metal that had started everything, that had transformed him from a blacksmith forging chains to a liberator forging freedom. He looked at them for a long moment, these tools that had served their purpose so perfectly. Then, in a gesture that felt both symbolic and necessary, he threw them as hard as he could into the surrounding forest. They disappeared into the underbrush, lost forever, no longer needed. The group settled in a small community of other formerly enslaved people just across the Canadian border. It was a modest place, houses cobbled together from whatever materials could be found, people working hard to build lives from nothing. But it was theirs. They were free to come and go as they pleased, free to earn wages for their labor, free to make decisions about their own lives. Isaac found work as a blacksmith again. But this time, he was paid for his labor, respected for his skill. He built a small forge and began taking commissions, crafting tools and household items for the growing community. But he also began crafting something else. Documentation of their journey, written accounts of how they had escaped, detailed descriptions of the Underground Railroad's operations. He worked with literate members of the community to ensure these stories were recorded, preserved, passed on. Because Isaac understood something crucial, their escape was not just about 7 individuals finding freedom. It was about proving that liberation was possible. about providing a roadmap for others who might follow, about demonstrating that the systems of slavery were not as impenetrable as they seemed. Every person who successfully escaped, every story that was told and retold, every example of ingenuity and courage, these things chipped away at the institution of slavery, revealing its vulnerabilities, inspiring others to resist. In the years that followed, Isaac learned that Thornhill Plantation had never recovered from the escape of 7 enslaved people. The economic loss was significant, but more damaging was the psychological impact on the remaining enslaved population. They had seen that escape was possible, that the masters were not all-powerful, that someone had dared to resist and had survived. Over the next decade, more people escaped from Thornhill Plantation than from any other in the county. Eventually, Silas Thornhill was forced to sell the property, broken by an economic system that depended on human bondage and that began to crumble once the bondage was resisted. Isaac married Clara, and together they raised children who were born free, who would never know chains, who would grow up understanding themselves as fully human rather than property. He taught his children blacksmithing, but more importantly, he taught them the stories. His mother's stories of African ancestors who had walked as kings and queens, Jeremiah's lessons about appearing simple while being anything but, the tale of 7 people who had refused to accept their designated role and had forged their own freedom. The keys Isaac had crafted were lost in the Canadian forest, but their legacy lived on. In the stories told around dinner tables, in the courage of those who followed the paths he and others had blazed, in the slow but inexorable movement toward abolition that would eventually come not through the kindness of slaveholders, but through the resistance of the enslaved and their allies. As Isaac grew old, his hands gnarled by decades of working metal, he would sometimes be asked by young people born into freedom, was it worth it? The risk, the danger, the possibility of death or recapture? His answer never varied. Every single moment. Because the alternative wasn't life, it was existence. They tried to reduce us to things, to property, to bodies without minds or souls. But we proved them wrong. Every step we took toward freedom, every lock we opened, every chain we broke, these were declarations of our humanity, and that's worth any risk. The final years of Isaac's life were marked by a sense of profound completion. He had lived to see the American Civil War, had watched from Canada as the institution of slavery that had stolen his youth finally began to crumble under its own moral bankruptcy and the resistance of millions. He had lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation, though he knew it was not the generosity of Lincoln, but the courage of people like himself, like his companions, like the countless unnamed resistors throughout history that had made liberation possible. When Isaac died in 1889 at the age of 58, he was surrounded by children and grandchildren, by Clara, who had been his partner in every sense, by Samuel and Moses, who had survived the journey with him. His funeral was attended by people from across the region, formerly enslaved people who knew his story, young people who had heard the legends of the blacksmith who forged keys to freedom. They buried him with a single item placed in his coffin, a key. Not one of his original keys, lost long ago in a Canadian forest, but a symbolic one crafted by his oldest son. It represented everything Isaac had been, a craftsman, a liberator, a man who had understood that the same hands that could forge chains could also forge the tools to break them. Isaac's story did not end with his death. It lived on in the accounts written by those who knew him, in the oral traditions of the communities he had helped establish, in the historical record of the Underground Railroad. His keys, both literal and metaphorical, had opened doors not just for 7 people, but for the understanding of resistance itself. The recognition that oppressed people are not helpless victims, but active agents capable of extraordinary courage, ingenuity, and determination. The plantation where Isaac had been enslaved continued to exist as a physical location long after slavery ended, but it transformed. The forge where he had learned his craft and where he had secretly created his keys eventually fell into disrepair. but fragments of it remained. Historians would later excavate the site, finding among the ruins small pieces of worked metal, hints of secret projects, evidence of resistance hidden within the daily routines of oppression. In our contemporary moment, Isaac's story serves as a reminder of truths that remain relevant across generations. It reminds us that freedom is not granted by the powerful, but seized by the courageous, that the tools of oppression can be turned into instruments of liberation, that human dignity cannot be extinguished, no matter how brutal the systems designed to crush it. It reminds us that intelligence, creativity, and strategic thinking are not the exclusive province of the privileged, but are universal human capacities that flourish even under the most restrictive conditions. Isaac's keys opened locks. But more than that, they opened possibilities, for himself, for his companions, for the generations that followed. They demonstrated that no system of oppression is as absolute as it claims to be, that vulnerabilities exist in every architecture of control, that a determined person with skill and courage can find and exploit those vulnerabilities. The chains of slavery were real, heavy, brutal things. But so were the keys that broke them, and those keys were forged not by saints or superhumans, but by ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, who refused to internalize the dehumanization directed at them, who maintained their sense of self-worth and possibility even when everything in their environment told them they were worthless. As we remember Isaac and the countless others like him whose names history has not recorded, we honor not just their escape, but their resistance, not just their freedom, but their refusal to be reduced to the roles assigned to them by an oppressive system. We remember that liberation is always possible, that human creativity and courage can overcome even the most entrenched injustice, that the keys to freedom are sometimes forged by those who are themselves in chains. Isaac's story is ultimately a story of hope, not the passive hope that waits for rescue, but the active hope that builds tools, plans strategies, takes risks, and refuses to accept that the present condition is the final word on human possibility. It is hope hammered into iron, possibility forged in fire, freedom crafted by calloused hands that understood both the weight of chains and the power of keys. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that we are not defined by the chains that bind us, but by what we do in response to them, that our humanity is not determined by how others treat us, but by how we treat ourselves and each other, that the tools of our liberation are often found in the very skills we develop while surviving our oppression. Isaac's keys are gone, lost in a Canadian forest more than a century ago. But their echo remains in every act of resistance, in every refusal to accept dehumanization, in every person who looks at the locks on their own life and dares to imagine crafting the keys that will open them. The sound of metal striking metal was not just the rhythm of labor, it was the drumbeat of liberation being hammered into existence, one secret strike at a time. And that drumbeat continues, across generations and continents, in the hearts of all who refuse to be chained and who dare to forge their own freedom. This is the story of Isaac, the enslaved blacksmith who forged his own keys to break the plantation's chains. But it is also the story of human resilience, of ingenuity born from necessity, of courage that flowers even in the darkest conditions. It is a story that honors the memory of those who suffered under slavery while celebrating their resistance, that acknowledges the horrors of that institution while refusing to let those horrors be the final word on the lives lived within it. May we remember Isaac not as a victim who was saved, but as an agent of his own liberation who saved himself and others. May we honor his memory by recognizing the full humanity of all enslaved people, their intelligence, their creativity, their strategic thinking, their courage. And may we carry forward the spirit of his keys, understanding that the tools to unlock our own and others' liberation are often already in our hands, waiting only for the courage and vision to use them. The forge burns still in the hearts of those who refuse to accept chains. The keys are still being crafted by those who dare to imagine freedom. And the story of Isaac, of one man who turned the tools of his enslavement into the instruments of his liberation, continues to echo across time, reminding us that no lock is truly unbreakable, no chain is truly unbreakable, and no human spirit is ever truly conquered as long as hope, courage, and determination remain alive. This is the legacy of the enslaved blacksmith who forged his own keys to break the plantation's chains, a legacy not of passive suffering, but of active resistance, not of victimhood, but of agency, not of despair, but of hope hammered into being through skill, courage, and an unbreakable belief in the fundamental dignity and worth of every human soul.